Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Donald Wallenfang. A great joy to be with you in this live stream entitled Love, Creation, and Community in the Work of Edith Stein, asking the question, can I love myself? Is this possible? What would this mean? This is what we're going to find out as we continue to talk with a lot of commentary from my 2017 book, Human and Divine Being, a study on the theological anthropology of Edith Stein. So this is a fascinating question. Can I love myself? Can I love myself? It has a lot to do with the question, can I love the other person facing me? How is love possible without otherness? When we think along with Edith Stein, she recognizes through the method of phenomenology the basic anthropological shape, we could call it, of intersubjectivity, a metaphysics of intersubjective becoming. To be human is to become vis-a-vis the other, vis-a-vis other persons. Just yesterday, I was reading about the very moving life story of Helen Keller, the first woman who was both blind and deaf to earn a college degree. A tremendous story, very moving story. But I was reading a part of her autobiography where she talks about the day she learned from her teacher, Anne Sullivan, language, when her teacher Anne would write on her hand letters in relation to objects she was holding. And finally, when she poured cool water over her hands and Anne wrote the word water on her hand, and this whole world of language and meaning opened up for Helen Keller. Her existence was nestled within, woven together with other persons. And so it is for each one of us. Our existence is intersubjective. So through the methods of phenomenology and metaphysics, we want to come to understand what is meant by this creaturely existence as intersubjective becoming even better. So whereas God is understood as pure act for Edith Stein, creatures are ever in a state of becoming. And we might wonder, what is the German word she's using that we're translating in English, becoming? The German word is Werdegang, that we translate as becoming. To become is to change, and it is the movement in which the various potencies of a person are actualized by a prior act, by something acting on the potencies to bring them into life. And the fact is, persons, we cannot in any way actualize all of the potencies about our being on our own. It requires facing the other, interacting with the other, just like Helen Keller and Sullivan. Intersubjective becoming. We together help to actualize the potencies, one inside the other. Our lives are intertwined. Our lives are in the process of becoming, developing, evolving. So this is what Edith Stein is getting at when she would say that all creatures are ever in a state of becoming, Werdegang. For example, we think of a plant, the plant structure, through its biological processes of evolution. This process of becoming of the plant structure is an evolution toward a definite end, namely the fully unfolded gestalt with everything that belongs to it, including the ripened fruit. And this process of becoming has itself a very definite gestalt. It has a temporal rather than a spatial structure because it involves a definite kind of progression. This teleology. She uses the language of Gestalt in German. So especially living being, biological organism, has a gestalt to unfold, but all the more so for persons. What is the personal gestalt of this one and that one? A gestalt is, we could say, a form, a character of being, a very specific personality, ethos, the shape, the specific configuration of this or that being. And so this unfolds over the course of time, and it has a temporal character about it. It's not revealed all at once, but it's revealed gradually through this intersubjectivity of personhood, the gestalt of humanity as such, but also this individual person and that individual person. Each one has a special, unrepeatable, irreducible gestalt in relation to all the others. Creaturely existence is ever in a state of constant flux between actuality and potentiality. The potencies of created beings never cease to be actualized anew. Yet within this constant state of becoming, creatures become co-creators with God. The divine logos is operative in all of the various approaches to reality. So take, for example, biology, psychology, sociology, philology, physiology, theology. All of these ologies are built on the logos, the common principle of sense making. And language is involved, meaning is involved, interpretation, communication is involved. Helen Keller talks about the most important day of her life, again, was when Anne Sullivan helped her discover language, meaning making, communication, interacting in a rational way with her environment. Even though she couldn't see, she couldn't hear, but she could still feel, smell, and taste the worlds around her. But it was her teacher, Anne, who helped discover this, who helped breathe life into Helen Keller and put her in better touch with the logos of the cosmos. So we have cosmology, another field of study too. But all of these ologies, biology, cosmology, theology, whatever it is, depends on the common logos, the common stock of reason and meaning-making capacity in the person. Every ology suffix points to this logos from which it is derived, and moreover, to the divine logos from which all logi are derived. The divine logos is the pure actuality of meaning that gives rise to all subsequent discursive meanings. Logos is meaning, word, rationality. Every created species participating in the divine logos or ratio, by virtue of its rational nature, acts as a personal agent of divine creativity. Okay, so this is so interesting to think along with Stein on these points. And at this point, within doing philosophy, we're interacting now more directly with theology. And the warrant for doing this is the unity of these concepts that we're getting from metaphysics. So pure act is what we mean by divinity. And if we establish the veracity of pure act, that there must be pure act, that there must be a first cause, then we think about what does this first cause have to do with reason, with sense making that we experience as person. We can say everything. So we have the divine logos, to use with a capital L, and then we have all of these various logoi, which are our fields of study in the university: biology, chemistry, psychology, theology, philosophy, history, mathematics. All these various logi each have their own role, gathering up the whole of reality, the whole of truth, and relating it back to the logos from which it all comes. So this is another word we use for divinity, and in Christianity, it's writ large. In the Gospel of St. John, for example, where we read in the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And then later on in verse 14, and the Logos became flesh and made his dwelling among us. So in Christianity, the Logos is identified specifically with Christ, God the Son, the Word of the Father. So the Greek word logos is translated most often into English within Christian theology as Word, the eternal Word of the Father, the eternal reason, meaning, and meaningfulness of the Godhead, of divinity. There is a foundational basis upon which our reason stands. If there's any common rationality at all, it's due to its being anchored in the eternal logos of God. So this is what Edith Stein is getting at. Again, when earlier she's talking about this unity of a totality of meaningful existence that we experience as persons. And the German here is Sinn Ganzes. This whole, this meaningful whole, this meaningful whole that is tethered to the Logos, who is the eternal Logos of God the Father, who is God the Son, who becomes flesh, and we call him Jesus of Nazareth, the Logos, not just as a kind of abstract idealism, but an incarnate Logos with flesh and bone and face and name. This Logos is Jesus, Jesus the Christ, Jesus the Savior, Jesus the eternal Word of the Father, who allows us to make meaning of anything and everything. And as much as a meaning is related to the logos of meaning, the divine logos of meaning, we find it meaningful as part of this unity of a totality of meaningful existence. So thank you for your question, Absalom. So what is the anti-logos? Well, the biblical author, St. John, identifies the anti-logos and calls it the antichrist. Yes, in First John we read about the antichrist, and it's precisely the antichrist who casts illusion, who obstructs the creature's access to the logos. So if we want to know what is the antichrist up to, it is this diabolical interception of the unity of a totality of meaningful existence. It is all the temptations of nihilism, the temptation to nothingness, the temptation to death, the temptation to a lack of meaning in life, to a complete fragmentation and obliteration of meaning. So the anti-logos, the antichrist, actually, I would not associate it directly with any particular political ideology, but with ideology in general, whether from the far left or the far right. And after all, extremes meet. Aristotle says this. John Cashin says this. Extremes meet, and truth and virtue and this unity of a totality of meaningful existence is encountered and lived through the via media of thoughts. The via media, the middle way, avoiding extremes, renouncing reductionisms, continuing to think to the whole, to be one of the faithful stewards who gathers up the fragments of meaning in this life and shares them, synthesizes them, integrates them, and helps to communicate them with other people too. So this is what Edith Stein is getting at here. And it's wonderful to think along with her. So we're not at this point giving an apologetic for the existence of God. We are rolling with it. We are believing. And by believing, we understand better. We understand more, as St. Augustine said. I believe in order to understand, and I understand the better to believe. So we can't access the fullness of reality without the assent of faith, the intentionality of faith in relation to divinity, and the revelation of divinity that reason cannot reveal to itself. But nevertheless, the revelation is rational in as much as it proceeds from the divine logos, uh, in which all rationality is anchored. So this is what we're finding with Edith Stein. On a more basic level, all individual living beings, large and small, act according to the generative life principle, which directs their becoming in an involuntary way. This Stein observes in following the passage from her book, Finite and Eternal Being, where she writes, "The individual is a ministering instrument of the Creator in actualizing specific forms, not merely in the manner in which dead material structures are tools, but a creative instrument in producing itself in the process of growth and in generating progeny by means of reproduction." So let's think through this so far together. The individual, a ministering instrument of the Creator. We find our being already formatted, already configured. When I'm conceived and as I grow and develop, it's not up to me. Do I have brown hair and brown eyes? Am I male or female? What's the color of my skin? And things, what language do I speak based on where I grow up, where I'm from? There's so many things that are determined in advance. At the same time, there's all of this indeterminism about my being left to be determined, potencies left to be actualized. And I discover myself to be a ministering instrument, a servant of the plan of God, if I let myself be so, but my being itself, that it has been received into being, it is being given, is in relation to the source and the cause of its being, the Creator. And I am a ministering instrument of the Creator when specific forms are actualized in my being, not merely in the manner in which dead material structures are tools like a hammer or a screwdriver or a chisel, but a creative instrument, a living instrument with freedom, with intellectuality, in producing itself through the process of growth and in generating progeny. So on the natural level, on the biological level, this is the case with all biological species. In the unfolding of each one's being, something of the Creator is revealed. Even in those pesky mosquitoes, something of the Creator is revealed. We might continue to wonder what that is. But the individual remains creature even in these creative activities. Its creative power, or what Hedwig Conrad Martius, one of Edith Stein's good friends, calls creative potency, is borrowed and measured. So I can say I'm a creative person, or I'm a YouTube creative, or I'm an author. But any creativity that I have, that I exhibit, is coming from the Creator, the Logos, the author of existence. I have a share in it, but my creativity, my poesis, is not absolute. It's not completely original, as if I too create something from nothing. What I create, I already have so much to work with. And there's so much to work with, including my own being, is what the Creator, God, has put into being from nothing. Even language, for example, I certainly did not invent the English language. I inherited it. And so I try to work within it. So everything I have at my disposal, I have so clearly as a creature. All these creative capacities, creative potencies, creative powers, they're borrowed and measured from divinity. Divinity is the primary point of reference, the sine qua non for any creaturely creativity. By serving in self-formation and reproduction, and we're thinking especially about biological species here, by serving in self-formation and reproduction, the formation, preservation, and propagation of the species, and by consuming itself in these processes, the individual becomes, as it were, a victim of its vital task. This phrase is so powerful in the work of Stein, and how her contemplation on living organisms, biological beings, but through metaphysics and phenomenology, everything is coming to light. So let's think with her what she's saying here, starting with the German term that she uses, Lebensaufgabe. Lebensaufgabe. So this is what we could translate vital task. And as a living creature, each one of us has a vital task that we are involved in, a script that really has already been inscribed in so many ways in our flesh, in our personhood, in our intersubjectivity. And in our biological being as human beings, all these cellular processes, cellular reproduction called mitosis in our case, and metabolism within the cells, within the mitochondria of the cells, all these things, this growth development, the genetic blueprint, the DNA, the RNA, the unfolding of the being is already uh, inscribed, it's already determined, the architecture already is there, the formal causality is present with the inception of each new living organism. And the organism grows and develops according to the vital task at hand, and the living organism becomes a victim of the vital task, expending its energies to live. So that's why this is called a vital task, but it is a paradoxical one. I live to the degree that I die. I become a victim of it, so that there's a progression from death to life. The potencies of life emerge from the phenomenon of death, of giving way to another through reproduction, through procreation, that my energies are spent in becoming a father or becoming a mother, and that the self is spending itself, giving itself up, perhaps to the point of abandonment, to share the gift of life with the other who had none or will have none unless I pour my life out for the sake of the other. So I become a victim of the vital task already assigned to me in my humanity, in my case, in my masculinity, in my manhood, in becoming a husband and a father, and how I live my life. To the degree that I die, I grant life to the other. And this is what is taught in the gospel of Jesus, Jesus of Nazareth. He says, unless you lose your life, you will not save it. So the paradox is through death I grant life and I also share in it. We could at least say vicariously, but also in terms of the supernatural attributes of my existence, the immortality of my soul, the unending, unconditional love of God for me, body and soul, I will not die. But I will not die to the degree that I die. That's how it works, the logic of the cross and all of this. Becoming a victim of its vital task. Every biological organism is involved in this. Every animal, every plant, every bacterium, protist, fungi, archaea, all of these biological organisms sooner or later become the victim of their vital tasks that's already inscribed in their being. And we call it living being. It has certain characteristics of growth, development, reproduction, metabolism, nutrition, hydration, metabolism, oftentimes locomotion, movement. Um, but Edith Stein is getting at this universal gestalt of a living organism. And she's reflecting from this very basic observation of natural science, putting it in a philosophical key, and then eventually we'll relate this to theology like I'm doing here. So this is a great concept in her work, one that I continue to be fascinated with, how the individual living being becomes, as it were, a victim of its vital task. In this poetic passage, Stein points to the kenotic circle of life, wherein living creatures give themselves over through their vital task to the point of abandonment. And again, as Jesus says in the Gospel of St. John, chapter 12, Amen, amen, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains just a grain of wheat. But if it dies, it produces much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will preserve it for eternal life. So, wow, very hyperbolic language Jesus is talking about. So I begin with the question, can I love myself? And these are the words of Jesus. So he'll say this on one hand, but on the other, he'll say, love your neighbor as yourself. We might wonder, what does he mean by this? On the one hand, I have to lose my life to save it. On the other, I have to love my neighbor as I love myself. On the one hand, if I love my life, I lose it. But on the other, if I hate my life, I preserve it for eternal life. How does this work, this paradoxical logic of the cross? This is what Edith Stein is investigating. And concretely speaking, this is to say that all these observations of natural science, when we see creatures expending their being to give rise to the offspring or to defend the offspring, this instinctive conatus, this conation toward life, self-preservation, not only of the individual, but even more so of the species, that each individual is at the service, like it or not, of the common good of the whole species. We might wonder, what does this mean to be human? And how can this be lived out without uh, forcing a political stronghold over and against the freedom of the individual, like communism would do? But at the same time, the other extreme of a kind of capitalistic mentality that takes no account of one's neighbor and doesn't seem to care that the other is so needy and poor and dying. The via media between ideological extremes is very important, especially for philosophy. And philosophy helps us to live in the via media and to avoid extremes, to avoid the near occasion of ideology. So thinking again about biological beings, through growth and reproduction, they demonstrate an inner determination toward life and the renewal of that life. Living creatures spend themselves in service to their intrinsic proclivity for extending their lives and the lives of their offspring over the course of time and within the domain of space. In the natural process of growth and development, living beings act as ministering instruments of divine creativity, exhausting their energies and resources to achieve their predetermined tasks. While the individual living being strives naturally for the preservation of its own life, it ultimately yields to its vital task to reproduce and sustain its own kinds. If this were not the case, life would cease at a certain point altogether. Without the survival of offspring, a species becomes extinct. Edith Stein contends that there is in living beings a manifold of material elements held together, permeated, and molded into an organic whole by a superior living form. The being of the form is life, and life is the forming of matter in 3 stages, she says in her book, Finite and Eternal Being. Life is the forming of matter in 3 stages. Number 1, transformation of the structural elements. Number 2, self-formation. And number 3, reproduction. Life generates life by becoming a willful victim of itself. So what is she saying here? What else is she saying about becoming a victim of one's vital task as a living organism? That the grand gestalt, the cosmic form of which all living organisms participate in, is what we call life. What we call life. Life has form. In fact, it has many forms, but anything that is living participates in the genus we call life. To live is a formal cause of all living beings. This is philosophy. Does your intellect hit upon it? Does your intellect hit upon the givenness of the meaning of life? Does your intellect hit upon the metaphysical truth about the interior a priori form called life, in which all living beings, individual beings, participate? In which all living individual beings find their meaning for being precisely as living. So Edith Stein is really thinking about the meaning of life directly here. What does this concept life mean? What is the meaning of life? What is this metaphysical genus we call life, and the form we call life, and its inclusion of so many different individual living beings that are alive? So we hear Hamlet and Shakespeare saying, to be or not to be, that is the question. And here with Edith Stein, we can ask, to live or not to live, that is the question. To answer the question, we have to investigate the meaning of life through phenomenology and the metaphysics and metamorphosis of life through the classical metaphysics. Life generates life by becoming a willful victim of itself. Life begets life, and to live is to evolve, to become. I don't know about you, but welling up in me is the sense of vocation when I study this work of Edith Stein. I cannot deny that I am a living being, an individual living being. I cannot deny that the vital task has already been assigned to me from an elsewhere. Even we could say the alterity of life in relation to the finite living being. There is an alterity to the form life in relation to the concrete instantiation, moreover, material instantiation of life. I sense the vocation to have something to do more intentionally than I have before with this dramatics of life. I cannot deny that I have been granted living being with so many already determined significations about this living being in terms of growth and development. Who can thwart it? Yes, we can thwart it, but we can't overturn the truth of growth and development of the organism, of the person. This is how it goes because it already has been choreographed from an elsewhere that precedes, from an unfathomable and untraversable distance, those of us finite creatures who find ourselves caught up in this mystery of life. Life begets life, and to live is to evolve, to become. And the beauty of Christianity is here we have a God who enters the thick of it, who doesn't just put it all in motion, sit back and observe, but the God who sustains it through and through as foundation, force, and form. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who has a sacred name and who shows his face by incarnating it through the Blessed Virgin Mary. And we call him Jesus. Jesus of Nazareth, God who has face and name, enters the thick of this universe of becoming. And so we read in the Gospel of St. John, chapter 1, verse 14, and the Word, the Logos, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. He became flesh. Let's look at the Greek there. Let's look at the Greek, the Gospel of John, chapter 1, verse 14. The becoming of God. This is quite unlike divinity to do such a thing, because God, by definition, does not become, does not change. But here we read the eternal word of the Father, who is God the Son, who is not a creature, but the Creator, one of the three persons of the Trinity. His substance is divinity. And yet this God the Son, kai halogos sarx egeneto, in Greek. And the word egeneto became sarx, flesh. The Logos became flesh. Where do we see this? In any other religious tradition aside from Christianity, we don't. We don't see the Logos, who is God, the Logos of God, becoming flesh once and for all, irrevocably, in order to save creatures. But this is what we see in Christianity. So if as philosophers we love the Logos, we love logic, we love reason, we love discursive reasoning, we love rationality, we love the Logos wherever it's to be found, and to say with Saint Justin the Martyr in the 2nd century, the Logos of reason is the Logos of faith. The Logos of philosophy is the Logos of theology. We don't divide them. There is a unity of truth, a unity of being, a unity, therefore, of reason and sense-making. And this Logos is operative in theology and philosophy together. It is breathing with two lungs. It is flying with two wings, as John Paul II says in his 1998 encyclical Fides et Ratio. And who does he quote by name in this encyclical? Who does he reference, saying, here's a genuine Catholic philosopher? Edith Stein is one of the people he mentions. So we think along with her, and this marvel of the Logos of God becoming flesh, so as to grant life to those personal living creatures who were dying, who were becoming extinct by their own volition, by their own sin, by deliberately eclipsing the truth because they thought they knew better. Philosophy without humility is hubris. The concept of divine revelation itself enters into philosophy, assuring the philosopher of humility. Because if someone is too proud to turn to divinity, to turn to divine revelation, that philosopher will take his place, will usurp what is rightly the holy others. So divine revelation is not just an interesting experiment for philosophy. It's a condition of possibility for doing philosophy with integrity, to do philosophy responsibly. This is what we have in Edith Stein. So this term life in our philosophy signifies that form which animates matter by transforming it and uniting it with an integral individual whole. The living organism is an individual after all, even with all the symbiotic relationships with other living organisms inside and outside that organism, ourselves included. We have what countless microbiota at work within us help keeping us alive. And I can't be reduced to that microbiotum, but there's an otherness even in relation to the self, but it doesn't disqualify the distinctiveness of the self, nevertheless. And this is the logic, the paradoxical logic of marriage that we see in the Judeo-Christian tradition, Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. That we read, a man shall leave his father and mother, be joined to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. They're one flesh, but they still remain two. They still remain distinct persons, distinct individuals. Yet this unity, both spiritual and at times physical, is pointing to the paradoxical meaning of being human, moreover being a living creature at all, is that we are integrated, living inside one another. In fact, human life begins just this way, living inside its mother's womb. Talk about a symbiotic relationship as the offspring, the other within the self, the prophecy of maternity, bearing the other within the same, speaking a word not one's own. The form of life not only causes a being to be alive and to subsist as such, it also extends its ontological status of self becoming through replication of distinct species of living organisms arranged in an organic nexus of being. So to be living is to not to be alone. To be living is always to be in reference to other living beings. To be living is to recognize a moral exigency of sharing one's life with the other who had none, or whose life is on the brink of destruction. Yes, thank you for your comment. Philosophy without humility is hubris. Yes, inevitably so. And the beauty of humility is that we never reach the end of the project. Humility is a perpetual vocation, actually to think more. This is the paradox. If I'm too proud to turn my thought to the otherness of the other, then I think less. If in humility, that is caused by the otherness of the other, which is to say, the fact that there is another means I am not the totality of the universe after all. The otherness of the other provokes me outside of myself, recognizing I have more to learn from the other. I have so much more to learn from the other, especially when it comes to divinity, how much I have to learn from God, Why would I close off the most fertile source of learning? Why would I close off theos from the logos, which is to disqualify theology from the start? It really is a tragedy when this happens. Fortunately, we have thinkers like Edith Stein who don't do this. She was tempted to do this for a while in her own life, in her adolescent years, her young adulthood, but she undergoes a massive conversion and realizes that to philosophize with serious means to open the floodgates of divinity. Open the floodgates of divinity. Religion is not a bad word. In fact, it's essential for philosophy that's serious about discovering the truth. The truth that has to do with the whole and not just the parts. The truth that doesn't treat truth, the philosophy that doesn't treat truth like a microscope. If I approach the philosophical data like reducing everything to microscopic view, I see some interesting parts, but I lose sight of the macrocosm of the whole. If I stare too intently on one tree, I cannot see the forest. I cannot see all of the animals. I cannot observe the wind and the sky and the stars and the sun and the moon and the water and the stream and the ocean nearby. Philosophy must zoom in at times and zoom out. Both zoom in and zoom out. The whole requires both, requires as much. And the problem with so many contemporary projects in philosophy is they are too myopic. They are too microscopic, confusing the part for the whole over and over and over, even when it comes to the general concept of reason, as if reason is sufficient unto itself, as if reason, by virtue of its reason, must be in competition with and against revelation and religion. Religion is not a bad word. The meaning comes from the Latin religare, where we get the English word ligament, what holds stuff together. Without religion, there's fragmentation. The parts are not held together. Religion is the adhesive of meaning for personal, rational, spiritual creatures. We don't want to treat the concept of religion like a caricature every time, like some stereotypical nonsense. We don't want to let religion be disqualified from the start in the name of reason. This actually is an irrational thing to do. It's to amputate the whole right away with no good reason. Genuine philosophy, authentic philosophy, will think toward the whole, open to the whole. And the greatest resources to investigate something like these transcendental experiences we have that involve beauty and goodness and truth, and moreover, faith, hope, and love, all of this virtuous living, we find the most ample sources are the religious ones and what we call religious experience. If someone says, I'm not going to have a religious experience, that's what phenomenology can call the natural attitude from the start. Nobody can fold their arms and say, I close off to this kind of experience that just might be saturating. To live involves saturation. To live as a person involves a saturation of meaning. It's the truth about what gives and what signifies within lived experience. And even more, individual beings do not exist autonomously or independently of one another. To be alive is to be involved in the matrix of living things, living beings. And for human beings, living persons. We can't pretend like We exist apart from this enmeshment in a vitality of interpersonal relationships. All that is alive lives in relation to other living and non-living forms of being. Creaturely becoming takes its place within a global ecosystem of becoming. To live is to become. And to become within this global ecosystem of being becoming. This is what Edith Stein is observing. We don't live as automatons in an industrial cityscape of commerce. We are intertwined, and the more we try to deny it, the more the ache wells up in the soul that I am not an anima technica vacua, to quote Hans Urs von Balthasar. I am not a technologized, vacuous soul. My soul is destined for meaningful interpersonal relationship with so many others. My soul is destined for love within this global ecosystem of becoming. The form of life constitutes the form of life itself. Life as form constitutes a comprehensive unit of all living beings in their interconnectedness. There is no single individual living creature independent of the rest. Life is interdependent, symbiotic existence. Regarding the original appearance of living creatures from a strictly philosophical perspective, Stein prefers to leave open the question of their initial emergence. So the question of when did life begin historically? It's a great question, and it's hard to access the answer because it was so long ago. This much is certain from paleontology, archaeology, um, molecular biology, all of these fields of study. Life has been around for a long, long, long time. And we wonder, when does it originally appear, these living creatures? And in response to this question, Edith Stein writes, again in her book, Finite and Eternal Being, regardless of whether we envisage the genesis of things as a progressive evolution from chaos to cosmos, or a continuous transformation of a primordial cosmos, we are dealing with a sequence of formations, and it must remain undecided whether these formations are to be conceived as temporarily separated works of creation or as merged in one creative fiat. So at the time she's writing in the first part of the 20th century, first half of the 20th century, she's speculating, and this is the classic creation versus evolution debate, but for Catholic thoughts, it's one and the same. It doesn't matter how the matter got to be the various configurations it is today. God made it. This much is certain. And God orchestrates the evolutionary processes within biology. God orchestrates the evolution of history and what's going on cosmologically in terms of stars and planets and any kind of matter there is, including dark matter. So as far as the exact details of the beginning, of the origin, of the Big Bang, and what else we might call this 0 point of beginning of the universe, and then the question, the beginning of living organisms. For faith, it's very inclusive. We have biblical texts, but we also have fossil records, and we reconcile all the data of knowledge there. Truth does not contradict truth. Religious faith and natural science ought to speak to one another. There should be dialogue here. We don't have to be in a camp. That's ideology. That's fundamentalism, whether it's in the form of biblical fundamentalism or a kind of natural science fundamentalism. We want the dialogue to ensue and continue. This is essentially what Edith Stein is saying. And she writes also in her book, Potency and Act, philosophy based on natural reason brings us to the act of creation, which alone is able to bridge the gulf between being and non-being, to leap from spirit to matter. But here philosophy halts before a locked gate, creation. As taught by faith, remains a mystery for our knowledge. What is absolutely spiritual and actual calls into being its direct opposite. What is non-spiritual and potential. So there's a lot of meaning here in this quote from Edith Stein's book, Potency and Act, concerning the act of creation. So this is where philosophy and theology definitely speak to each other, should speak to each other, because otherwise we just have an aporia. We have an aporia for thought. But let's think about what she's saying here. So we have a distinction we can make in philosophy between being and non-being. The essence of the universe is actually non-being. We say, well, the universe has a being. It's there. It has existence. Every star has being. All these configurations of galaxies, solar systems, our own included, planet Earth, all the diversity of beings on Earth, so richly diverse, incredibly richly diverse, both living and non-living. But the essence of each one of these beings as a finite being is more non-being than being. In fact, every material existent as it exists right now, or just was, there was a time it was not that. There was a time I was not, you were not. Every animal was not, every plant, every tree, every molecule as it is currently configured, every subatomic particle. Because this world of finite beings is in constant flux, fluctuation, change, becoming, the essence of an individual being, and therefore the essence of the whole matrix of finite being and its rapid ephemeral change, is non-being. It's on the verge of extinction at every moment. But we have this metaphysical distinction between transient, finite being on the verge of non-being, because it came from that. Every individual, we can say that, came from non-being and exists for a time and goes out. But then we have being itself, in terms of unlimited, infinite existence itself. As Parmenides says, being is not lacking. If it were, it would lack everything. So infinite being itself, act itself, that is not a fluctuation between potency and act in a finite order of becoming. Being itself, not changing, not becoming, not moving from cause to effect like this whole matrix we call the universe. The distinction between the two, how do we get this on the brink of non-being, this essential non-being, because barely being, from being? What is this movement here, where being itself grants temporary being to beings that were not always there, that were not always the case? And this bridge, Stein says, We can use the Latin phrase, is creatio ex nihilo. Creation from nothing. Creation from nothing. Who's doing the creating? Being itself. Yes, divinity, God. What do we mean by the word God? The primary cause, the first cause, the constant cause, lifting finite being out of non-being, keeping it out of the nothing that it once was, granting it being in a constant way. So we have cratio ex nihilo concerning the origin, the beginning, the 0 points of this movement, this introduction of finite being in relation to infinite being. It's called creation. But we also have creatio continua that sustains this creation, that upholds this being. We might ask, why? Why do you do this, God? Why do you make something from nothing and sustain it? And this is where we have theology. Why does God do this? What's the reason for his creation? So philosophy based on natural reason brings us to the act of creation, which alone, act of creation, which alone is able to bridge the gulf between being and non-being, to leap from spirit to matter. So God, in metaphysical terms, is pure spirit, no admixture of matter, because what is matter? Potency. So this world's of essential non-being, because is not being itself, and no individual being grants itself being and wills to sustain itself in being. We have here matter, and Stein says this is the opposite of spirit in metaphysical terms. We have materia. We have the theoretical concept of prima materia, going back to Aristotle. It's a purely theoretical concept. We cannot point to pure matter, because pure matter is pure potency, whereas God is pure spirit, pure act. Non-being is pure potency. Doesn't even deserve to be named. To say the word is already to grant it some kind of being as a theoretical concept. But this world we call the universe is a world of becoming, which means it involves potency constantly. In every being, the whole matrix of this universe, we have potencies being actualized. And so what we mean by matter, what we experience as material being, is being that has been formed into various bodies, various individual configurations of elements, subatomic particles. And what is doing the forming is the metaphysical question. And it's not enough to say we have this series of efficient causes and effects, or material causes and effects. We still have this bridge to reckon with, to deal with in philosophy. The relationship between pure act and pure potency, and credit has to be given where it is due. And it is the purity of act that is being itself, that is divinity, that is God, that grants this world of becoming its reason for becoming, being as becoming, and in terms of origin and end. But philosophy here, and what I'm talking about, it halts, Stein says, before a locked gate. Creation is not a concept of philosophy straight away, but a concept of religious faith. It depends on questions about divinity and purported divine revelation in sacred texts and traditions, and an authority of truth-telling. That is rational. For Christianity, this is the claim. It's rational revelation. But nevertheless, even Christian philosophy halts before this locked gate we call creation and the doctrine of creation. As taught by faith, it remains a mystery for our knowledge. And to say mystery isn't to say we know nothing about it or has no meaning. It's just to say we can't access directly in every way the 0 point event of creatio ex nihilo. It is an item, an epistemological item for the intentionality of faith, the assent of faith in divine revelation. We have to grant this. We have to grant the concession. We have to concede to the priority of the authority of divinity. And that's a very rational move to make for philosophy. What is absolutely spiritual, that is God, and actual, calls into being its direct opposite, what is non-spiritual and potential. And we see the lowest grade of spiritual being, though Stein says every being involves some, relation to divine spirit for sure. Every individual being in the universe involves some formal causality, which is to say there's something of spirit to do even with the rock, even with the hydrogen atom, the inanimate kinds of being. Inanimate, yet not static. Even the atom is very dynamic and electrons in motion and interacting with the local environment constantly. But pure potency, materia prima, is the direct opposite of pure spirit, pure act, as non-spiritual per se and purely potential in relation to acts. This is incredibly helpful metaphysics coming to us from Edith Stein. And so I feel it's very much worth our time to think along with her on this. So just a few more points for the live stream today. Feel free to ask any questions, make comments in the chat. And I just love getting to take the time to investigate these texts together in these live streams. Again, if I'm teaching a course at a university or seminary, I can't go this slow and deliberately. What I've covered right here, some commentary from my 2017 book, Human and Divine Being, has been only about a page and a half, over an hour. And if you have only 14 weeks in a semester to talk about things, we will get much more to talk about through these live streams, daily live streams. Why not? Why do I do this? Your presence encourages me to do this. Thank you again. Thank you for your comments. You enjoy audio podcasts, taking advantage of long traffic congestions. Thank you. It's a pleasure. It's a gift. Thank you for your interest, and spread the word. Share the good word. Why do I do this? For the sake of the truth. I love the truth. I love to teach. I love to learn. I love to read. I love to study. I love to ponder. I love to investigate. I love to pray. I love to contemplate. But what I'm doing in the live stream is trying to incarnate what Stein is talking about in terms of this creaturely existence as intersubjective becoming, in that I want to share what I have received with you. I want to share this truth I've encountered with you. This is my primary motivation. And your presence, your interest, your responsiveness encourages me in this ongoing sharing. So just a few more points for this live stream. We think then, with Edith Stein as a critical phenomenologist, she leaves open the question of origins when narrowing her lens of investigation to natural phenomena. For her, she doesn't have to obsess over the inaccessible details of the beginning. It's enough for faith to assent to just the veracity, the truthfulness of what we're talking about here. This is enough. This is enough for faith. This is what's most decisive. And so we don't have as many details about the events which certainly is saturating of this creatio ex nihilo, but we do have it is the residue. What we do have is the residue and the effects we call the universe of the cause, that is God, of this creatio ex nihilo. We have the residue, we have the evidence, both physical and spiritual. And moreover, we have so much evidence from religious experience as to who this God is. What's most interesting for faith is not so much what this God does or has done, but who this God is. And yes, who this God is revealed in what this God does throughout history. But the person of faith, the one who dares to pray and love God, loves to learn more about God himself. And for Christianity, this God has been revealed as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit through Jesus of Nazareth and his church. And there's so much to explore within this revelation vis-a-vis reason. So this we do in Christianity. Within the scope of the natural sciences, a chronological sequence of living formations is observed. Investigation of natural processes of becoming is not concerned about the details of the supernatural act of creation which inaugurated creatio ex nihilo and continues to create creatio continua, finite being altogether. This is a question for metaphysics and for theology. But for a phenomenology of biological being, it is enough to reflect upon the givenness, the German word Gegebenheit, of finitude, creatureliness, and the processes of becoming in living existence. This is what philosophy is doing, always abstracting from the matter, always looking for the more inclusive concepts in relation to the more specific ones, but always wanting to relate the two, the general and the particular, the universal and the particular, the general and the specific, the global and the detailed, always relating the two. But philosophy does reach toward the whole more and more expansive and recognizes what Carol Houselander calls the inscape of Tabor, borrowing some of the language from Gerard Manley Hopkins, what Carol Houselander calls the inscape of the creator, the inscape of the creator within the fragment of the universe. This is what the mystics contemplate, like Julian of Norwich and the little spherical object that she held in her palm, and that this little spherical object revealed the whole universe, like a Hildegard of Bingen and her Scivias. Know the way through the via media, the middle way between extremes. It's so interesting. I'm reading through Hildegard of Bingen's, the exact title, The Book of Divine Works. The Book of Divine Works. It's a tremendous work. And what Hildegard is doing in her work, in her writing, I just love it so much. We have these drawings that especially other people made after the fact that are relating her visions that she had, but you see, you could study this drawing to no end, all the various details. And so in the commentary in this work, the Book of Divine Works, she'll talk about all the details of her vision. But we want to relate all of the minutiae of the details to this greater whole that lights up in the picture, in the artwork. This is Hildegard of Bingen. She's a thinker toward the whole. Thomas Aquinas is a thinker toward the whole. Edith Stein, a thinker toward the whole. John Paul II, thinker toward the whole. So many. Yes, and we want to join their company. That's what I'm trying to do. And I just love to study these things. And how Hildegard, she talks about the temperance involved throughout the cosmos, throughout the universe. That one wind tempers another, one out of the southwest tempering the northeast. How the moon tempers the sun. And how all these things happening concerning the temperaments of nature. And even in this medieval times, in relation to the temperaments of personality and the moral life and all of these things. It's a great thinking toward the whole. So the doctors of the church tend to be these thinkers that think the timeless because they're thinking the whole. And Hildegard of Bingen is one of them. Maybe Edith Stein will be one of these days. Her cause for being named a doctor of the church has already been made. We'll see what happens with that. But let's just think with Edith Stein a little more in this live stream then. In metaphysically reflecting upon the creaturely process of becoming, Stein extends the potency act hermeneutic to its full existential potential. So instead of pleading guilty to the Freudian accusation through this hermeneutics of suspicion that things religious are just a kind of expression of wish fulfillment, in Stein's approach to infinite being, she simply acknowledges the clarion metaphysical reality that Aristotle observed and articulated ages ago, where he writes in his Metaphysics, it is clear that actuality is prior to potentiality. It is a statement of the obvious. However, the obviousness of actuality's antecedents to potentiality goes largely unnoticed today because metaphysics is not held to be an academic discipline of importance. People go to university today all around the world and don't study metaphysics. And maybe they even study philosophy and still don't study metaphysics. Most graduate programs in philosophy, if they use the word metaphysics, it's in a more Kantian sense, a metaphysics of subjectivity and the inner workings of consciousness and perception and apprehension of things. But the metaphysics, the classical metaphysics of Aristotle and scholastic philosophy, and what Stein is bringing close to her contemporary phenomenology, is something that grants us access, full access to the question, what is being? Once again, what is being? We arrive at further clarity through metaphysics. What is being? What is human being? How do we know? How should we live? And these are the questions that begin and comprise the fields of ontology, theological anthropology, epistemology, and ethics, respectively. So the Kantian metaphysics, this contemporary metaphysics of epistemological metaphysics, can contribute to that category of epistemology, asking the question, how do we know? What is the science of knowing? And a lot of times the science of mind. How does the mind know what it knows? Okay, that has a place in the whole, but we have to go back with Thomas Aquinas in a metaphysical way, with Edmund Husserl in a phenomenological way, back to the things themselves, their givenness, their objectivity, their reality, the reality that gives itself before I interpret it. Welcome. So, these fields make up this whole of philosophy. Without an adequate foundation in metaphysics, in the question of what is being, in ontology, without an adequate foundation in this, the other fields will miss the mark inevitably, and especially the ethics will be skewed. If we don't take time to contemplate being, we don't know how to act within this world of being, becoming. Without an adequate foundation, these other fields will be lacking. So Stein puts Aristotle's fundamental observation about being in this way. She says, actual being emerges from a potential being and passes into a potential being, but all potentiality is phenomenally upheld by actuality, and it cannot uphold actuality. So as I've said in a previous live stream, Stein is using phenomenology as um, a kind of philosophical adhesive between these two metaphysical categories of potency and act, and what we mean by them. That it is actual being, it is act that upholds potential being or potency, not the other way around. Before the effect comes the cause, and the effect depends on the cause. And the cause itself, in terms of actuality, is what upholds the potentiality that was actualized to become an actual effect of being. So logically, according to the analogia entis, the analogy of being, this assertion leads us to the threshold of eternity, not just an abstract eternity, not pure act as a simply abstract impersonal concept, but rather the logic of Edith Stein takes us to meet a personal eternity that appears as necessarily anterior to finite, personal, self-reflexive, and co-creating creatures. So we can quote here St. Thomas Aquinas from his Summa Theologiae, and here we have in the Prima Pars, question 2, article 3, when he's talking about proofs for the existence of God. Thomas Aquinas says, we cannot but postulate the existence of some being having of itself its own necessity, and not receiving it from another, but rather causing it in others their necessity. This all people speak of as God. And for the distinction that Stein makes between eternal and finite being, we read from her book, Finite and Eternal Being. She writes, to the order of the created world belongs time. It is that whereby the finite is in the strictest sense distinguished from the eternal. Temporality itself is part of what distinguishes being itself from being becoming, essentially non-being, because what there once upon a time was not. Once upon a time, before time, and even within the course of time, the running course of time, all individual beings come and go in terms of material, in terms of bodies. This is for sure. So part of what makes the dividing line and the distinction between being itself and beings that verge on non-being is time. So with creatio ex nihilo is introduced time. Time makes possible creation. Time is concomitant with creation. Temporality is part and parcel. It's woven together with finite being in flux and change, because we don't have a movement. We don't have no motion without time. We have no event without time. But time is not some entity that grants it. It's more of a description of the sequence of things, the process of things. And we say it took time. But time itself is part of the meaning of the world of becoming. To move from potency to act by a prior actuality takes time. Time is, we could say, part of the condition of possibility for any event of becoming. So to wrap this live stream up then, thinking with Edith Stein, to the order of the created world belongs time. It is that whereby the finite is in the strictest sense distinguished from the eternal. For though we have encountered a meaning of finitude which does not signify a beginning and ending in time, namely the limitation of the diverse units of meaning with respect to their content. Okay, so what she's saying there has to do with each distinctive meaning in a more phenomenological sense. In terms of their the units of meaning, respect to their content, what each meaning means, there's a timelessness about this. A meaning doesn't have to, in itself, mean in time. There's a timeless, ahistorical essentiality of every meaning. So she said we can say this, but at the same time, pun intended, the demarcation of finitude from the unity of divine being, what I'm showing this demarcation here, she's saying, um, must nonetheless be understood as a being ordained toward temporal actualization. So involved in creatio ex nihilo, creation from nothing, is a being ordained toward this process of gradual actualization of different forms of being over the course of time. Temporality is part of creaturely existence by definition. But for divinity, it's not. There's no temporality for divinity because there's no potency about divinity. Divinity is pure act. Sometimes people will talk about the eternal now of divinity. I don't like that concept as much myself because it seems so static and boring, I guess. And I think divinity is dynamic. So even though there's no temporality with divinity, through the analogy of being, we still have to imagine the most colossal dynamism about divinity, who is responsible for creating this incredibly dynamic universe. So we could think more through, we might wonder about the analogy of time in relation to God, but one has to be careful there. Okay. So this is how we must understand the distinction between divinity and finite being. Why Stein titles her book Finite and Eternal Being. Based on that distinction, I continue to show. Finally, then, the potency act hermeneutic, while it may seem old-fashioned to some, when construed according to a phenomenological tonality, offers compelling insight into the question of being and the personal creature-creator relationship. Yet Stein goes one step further by elucidating the phenomenon of human personal evolution and community life, a community based on a fundamental openness to the other and openness to grace, the divine other, the holy other, holy, totally other, and totally sanctified other, both meanings. Human beings do not become in terms of biological being alone. After all, we are social, personal, spiritual creatures, and as such, we become in communal relation to one another. So I'll stop there and entertain the comment. Thank you for the comment. You say you approached Edith Stein casually through a book, Una Espiritualidad para Hoy, según Edith Stein. So spirituality for today, according to Edith Stein, by Monte Carmelo. Beautiful. I'm very glad to hear about that book, A Spirituality for Today, according to Edith Stein. It's great. She's a tremendous thinker. And I don't know if this book has been translated into Spanish, but I know this one has, by Mariano Crespo. Mariano Crespo translated this Finite and Eternal Being into Spanish, and it's a wonderful translation. He's a wonderful scholar from the University of Navarre, Spain, and I recommend that. So that's great to hear. Any other questions for today? Thank you for those who were able to join this live stream. Again, most of the commentary taken from my 2017 book, Human and Divine Being, still only in English, the original language it was written. Maybe someday someone might translate this into Spanish or other languages, but we'll see. But in any case, doing the live streams allows us to unpack the content all the more here. And thank you for joining me. I'm really enjoying this adventure through the work of Edith Stein, these concepts in metaphysics like potency and acts, finite and eternal being, but also the concepts out of phenomenology in terms of givenness, interpretation. Eventually, we'll get to things like empathy in the work of Edith Stein, but we have to set the stage with the question of being and the question of being given through classical metaphysics and contemporary phenomenology. So if you're not already a subscriber, I invite you to subscribe. I'd love to hear from you in the comment section. Thank you in advance if you're able to recommend any of the videos from my channel to friends you think would find this interesting. The more the merrier as we seek this truth together, this truth that is the whole. May we all continue to think toward this whole, to pray from the heart, and to live as a witness. We'll see you in the next one.